Well, the first hangout was quite a hangout. Rather than go into all the details about that hangout, I just thought we would roll right along. So this is just a reminder of the things that we covered in the hangout that pertain to Chapter 1 and that lead up to Chapter 2 for our hangout today. So let's get started. So Russell starts out, like a lot of these arguments start out, by sort of presenting direct realism, naive realism. They kind of mean the same thing, just different words for the same thing. It's the intuitive approach, the way we generally think about things when we don't really think about them. Just assume that there's a world out there, there's an object out there. So say the object is a table. There is a table out there, and I can just see it. I don't see that table by way of seeing something first. I just directly see the table. And then Russell says, well, that's all fine and dandy, but as soon as we try to be more precise, in other words, as soon as we try to really scrutinize what's going on, we immediately run into troubles. And the troubles we run into are expressed in these arguments against direct realism. Russell presents the perceptual variation. Well, you walk around the table and the table looks different from all these different angles and depending on the light and et cetera, et cetera. The argument about hallucinations. What do you do when there's clearly no object that you're looking at, but you're having this internal experience just as if there was an object? The arguments from illusion, which is sort of very similar to the argument from hallucinations. There's also this argument, which is sort of a science-based argument. Look, we already know from science that direct realism has got to be false. There's also this sort of sci-fi argument. Look, you can't say that the table is how it appears to you. What if there were aliens whose bodies were completely different from ours? And they looked at the table and saw something completely different. Who's to say which person is quote-unquote right there? Other animals definitely don't see the table the same way we see the table. Okay, I want to go back a little bit to the illusions. To me, that's kind of the most convincing for these appearances that have come to be known as sense data. Okay, so take a look at this grid here. You see those gray dots, those gray smudges that are at the intersection of the white lines? What are those? If you look specifically at each intersection, they disappear. But if you kind of look around the grid, well, there they are. What are those? There's the appearance of a gray dot, but we know the object itself doesn't have anything like that at its intersections. Well, let's call those appearances sense data. So now the way the argument kind of runs is something like this. I did the best I could here. I'm trying to do soundbite-y information. It's sort of like this. When I look, I see something change, or I see some property, but the object itself did not change. So there are these exceptional cases that are pretty obvious, and the grid is an example. Well, whatever changed, or whatever has that property, it can't be the object itself. Okay, what I see in these obvious exceptional cases, we'll call those sense data. Now, here's the thing. The experience in these obvious exceptions, it's the same as in a non-obvious exception. What I see in what I'm calling a non-obvious exception are sense data too, which means that what I see in every case are sense data. So they want to say that the quote-unquote veridical case, it's the same thing going on, and that these illusions and these other exceptions that are used to make the argument against direct realism are true in the so-called veridical case as well. Now, just real quick here, we didn't talk much about this, but there is this little response, this disjunctive naive realism, where they grant this idea that, yeah, there are these exceptional cases, like the grid, where something looks like it's there, but it's not there. But those are just exceptions. the experiences in both of those cases are actually not the same. So maybe in the exceptions, you can say what I see, you can call them sense data if you want to, but that doesn't mean that I'm seeing sense data in those cases that are not exceptions. So that's a disjunctivist view. Okay, so going back to Russell, these arguments lend support for this idea of sense data and the indirect realism that I think is in this book. So indirect realists say, yeah, there's a table, but I can't just see it. I can only see the table by way of seeing something else first. And what's the other thing I see first? Their sense data. So the sense data represent the table, and all we ever immediately see are the sense data. We don't immediately see the table. What we see is mediated. So it's not immediate, it is mediated. We know about the table indirectly because all we ever directly see are sense data. Now, I would love one day, let me just scroll over here, in the future, to do a hangout about arguments against sense data. There are some arguments against sense data, and they support direct realism. Penrose Escher's show sort of inconsistent sense data. The appearances themselves are inconsistent in those drawings. Also, there appear to be intermediate sense data. There's the spotted hen. There's an argument that you're reifying things, that you're equivocating things. There's there are some responses. So sometime I'd like to look into those. I'd like to do a hangout. I don't know, we'll see. Going back now. So we were here, indirect realism. If we grant that there are sense data, if we say that there is a table, but I can't just see it, the next question is, well, what's then the relation between the table and the sense data? And also, how do we know what the table is like, or even if there really is one? One answer we talked about really quickly was, well, they resemble each other, or the sense data resemble the actual table. And we got into, there were this idea of primary properties that you really directly see, and secondary properties that are indirectly seen but are sort of composed of and made up of primary properties. Well, the idealist is going to want to say, what are you talking about? Relations between the real table and the sense data of the table. We don't bother with those relations because there is no table. Everything is just mental. Russell responds to this in chapter 2, which is what we're going to do next. He says, no, there's a real table, and he's got his reasons. Now, another view is transcendental idealism. And I'm going to try to soundbite this the best I can. I think it's the idea that there is something out there, but who's to say it's a table? And if you think it's a table, what's your argument for that? So this kind of goes like this. I hope I do this justice. It's true, we can only directly experience our internal life, which is the phenomenal world. But there is an out there that transcends our experience, and that's the noumenal world. And transcend means, goes beyond, rises above, cuts across these phenomenal experiences. And that is a noumenal world. And we actually can know about that noumenal world by making arguments. So what kind of arguments? Transcendental arguments. Transcendental arguments start with some piece of experience that you take for granted, and these arguments show what must be the case about the noumenal world in order for that experience to be the way it is. So transcendental arguments ask and answer questions, and this is here. Some people who are watching know that this refers to the Pal Talkers. I'm not going to get into that for the people who don't know. Transcendental arguments ask and answer questions like, what fact about the world makes it the case that some experience is like that? Or by virtue of what is the experience like that? Or what's your argument for why it's a table? So Russell is going to give an answer. He's going to give his argument for why we should suppose there's a table. That's chapter 2. That's what the hangout tonight is going to be about. I hope you'll come. I don't know what you thought. I can tell you that I was very disappointed. And hopefully we can get into that today at 9 p.m. Eastern. I hope to see you there.